Right. Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms webinar. I'm Matt Helmers at Iowa State University, Extension Ag Engineer in the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering here at Iowa State, and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and also a faculty member involved with the Iowa Learning Farm. So I have the great fortune to help host many of these webinars, and excited for our webinar today as usual. And so this week we have Dr. Lisa Shulte Moore, that's a professor of natural resource ecology and management at Iowa State University, and also co-director of the Bioeconomy Institute. She's going to be talking to us today about understanding the opportunities and challenges of grass to gas. Man, I almost messed it up, of grass to gas, an integrated modeling study from the Grand River Watershed of Iowa and Missouri. And so with that, as usual, if you have questions as Dr. Shulte Moore is giving her presentation, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to her at the end of her talk. And so it gives me great pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Lisa Shulte Moore. With that, the virtual floor is all yours, Lisa.
Thank you, Dr. Helmers, and thank you to the Iowa Learning Farm team for inviting me to be here today and for all the great work that you do. I'm excited to share with you some initial work from a project that I'm fortunate to be a part of. And so it's the Sea Change Grass to Gas project, and it's a project funded by USDA Sustainable Agricultural Systems Grant that we got started on in 2020. The goal of this project is to look at advancing a new value chain in agriculture here in the Corn Belt, as well as also looking at the Mid-Atlantic region. We're fortunate to partner with colleagues at Penn State University, as well as with two industry groups, Raceline Alternative Energy and FDCE, as well as the USDA ARS. So you might ask, why a new value chain for agriculture, and what might that look like? The value chain that we're studying as a part of the USDA NIFA funded grant looks something like the picture that you see on top here. So, can we integrate in more continuous living cover within agroecosystems, within corn cropping systems particularly? And if we do that, is there a way that we can utilize that biomass to generate more value for agriculture, but then also for society in terms of greater environmental benefits that society is demanding and needs? So things like clean water and wildlife, and even sustaining our soils. So, in sum, what we're looking at in the grass to gas value chain is looking at anaerobic digestion and renewable natural gas to process that biomass, that plant-based biomass, and looking at that as in terms of either sole digestion or also co-digestion with manure associated with the animal agriculture industry. And why do we need to do that? Agriculture is so productive already. I think one of the things that we have to think about as we talk about any kind of changes is just kind of realizing that in this part of the world, certainly, it's corn and soybeans that pays the bills for farmers. And the gains in productivity over time have just been, phenomenal. I look back at some USDA data this morning, and on a national scale, the data was up to 2018. So if we look back 100 years, 100 years ago, the average bushel per acre in terms of corn production was 23.9 bushel per acre for the U.S. Today, of course, it's many times that, right? It's 176.4 bushels per acre for the U.S. in 2018, and I'm here in Iowa, so of course, Midwesterners were always above average. In 2021, it was 205 bushels per acre, which is truly phenomenal, and frees up a point of pride, of course, for farmers, but frees up so much more of society to do other things, other amazing things in terms of our work and our play as a result of that gains in productivity. But we also know about some of the, unintended consequences associated with some of that productivity. In particular, a concern to all of the farmers that I work with is, potential declines in soil quality and soil loss. And so, how do we maintain that productivity while also doing a better job of protecting our soil? In Iowa here, we all know about the challenges in terms of water quality, wildlife habitat, and there's also this trade-off between trying to keep current farms profitable while also supporting the future farmers on those farms. And so that's why we have to continue to innovate in agriculture and look at new ways of doing things. And this grass to gas project is just one of those investigations trying to look at new ways to do this, with this goal of having agriculture provide a full basket, right, a suite of both goods and services for society. And certainly, this picture is what motivates me as a scientist in terms of my work in agriculture, is like, how can we do it all? How can we support farms today and long into the future, as well as environmental, better environmental outcomes? Well, when I first got to Iowa State almost 20 years ago now, the first thing I did was meet with a bunch of folks that had a really depth expert in the system here of agriculture. And the key thing that I kept hearing from my mentors, Dick Shulte, Matt Liebman, Ricardo Salvador, Fred Kirschman, others, was that, wow, if we could do just one thing, if we could figure out how to have continuous living cover within our cropping systems, it would do so much, right? It would fix so many of the problems. It would help feed our soil, keep nutrients, right? But to be able to do that and keep farms profitable is a big challenge. Of course, many farmers have figured out already how to do that, and that's great. And we just need to help support more farmers figure out how to do that. And so this is one way, right, by growing winter crops. With my work here in Iowa, the way that I've predominantly focused my work, and it's just a matter of, how many hours do you have in the day, is, integrating in perennial systems into our annual cropping landscapes and being really strategic about where we put those perennial systems. And of course, the project that maybe many of you have heard of that's had great success has been prairie strips, right, where we're integrating in our native vegetation into corn and soybean fields in ways that make sense to farmers, right? We have about 15,000 acres of prairie strips here in the Midwest now, so it must make sense to farmers and farmland owners if we're seeing that level of adoption. But the next question is, can we utilize that biomass in ways that also generate more income in agriculture? And of course, the Strips project is, something that I'm really passionate about and have worked on. But of course, there's been over time between scientists and developing scientists with the students and postdocs, there's been over 100 people that have contributed to that body of work. That work with the Strips project, we've rolled right into that grass to gas project, right? So again, with this idea, can we utilize that biomass for a new fuel, in this case, that would be demanded by society? And what we're looking at here is trying to replace fossil natural gas with renewable natural gas. And this idea of using biomass for fuel or energy is not a new one. Right, a lot of people have come to the same conclusion. Like, we need to figure out how to keep our soils covered, and we need to be able to find a way to utilize that biomass. I think about when I first got to Iowa State 20 years ago, the Sheridan Valley Project, right, was one. Lots of work at Oak Ridge National Lab, University of Minnesota, Dr. David Tillman and Clarence Lehman. The ISU Comparison of Biofuel Systems project right here at Iowa State that was funded by ConocoPhillips in the early years. The University of Wisconsin and Michigan State, the DOE, the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, they're pursuing this goal. Other large USDA NIFA projects like the Sen USA project led by Ken Moore, the University of Iowa Biomass to Bioenergy Project, right? There's a theme here, right? Where a lot of people are looking at, potential way to integrate in more continuous living cover and then be able to use that biomass to replace fossil fuels. So that part is not new, right? The new part here is that we're looking at anaerobic digestion as a platform for converting that material to useful products demanded by society. And as an ecologist, how did I get to working on anaerobic digestion and renewable natural gas? Well, I have to give credit to a close collaborator on the Grass to Gas project, Rudy Raceland, who also met Rudy because of his interest in trying to sort out this trade-off and provide new value in agriculture. And Rudy was one of the first landowners that we worked with on the Prairie Strips project. He was, he saw that potential, and so developed a relationship with Rudy on Prairie Strips starting in 2013, and learned everything I know from first Rudy about anaerobic digestion and renewable natural gas from Rudy and his staff at Raceline Alternative Energy. And then also engineers like Dan Anderson here at Iowa State and Tom Richard at Penn State University, and a growing number of students that we have on the Grass to Gas project. It's been really fun and exciting. And so the cool thing about anaerobic digestion in comparison to, say, other platforms for converting biomass to a fuel or energy is that it's much more flexible as a conversion process, and it has advantages that way, as well as it can take advantage of a lot of existing infrastructure. So obviously people thought it was a good idea as well, and that's why USDA NIFA funded our work. Today I want to talk about a case study that's coming out of that project. And it's really two studies that we're now working to integrate. One is really a land use change and financial analysis study, and that was conducted by Ellen Audia as a part of her master's work here at Iowa State University. She was co-advised by John Tyndall, professor of natural resource ecology and management, and is now a PhD student at the University of Southern Illinois. And then another PhD student, Olumide Olafaskin, who's in mechanical engineering, working with Martin Bauwright. And we're working, Ellen and John and I have joined forces with Olumide and Mark on the second techno-economic and life cycle analysis. So today I want to, dig down deeper into this particular study, this case study. And the case study looks at the Grand River watershed of southern Iowa and northern Missouri. You can see it in the very dark or the black in that map. And it's a large watershed. I should have converted this to square miles, or acres, but 20,000 square kilometers. And most of it is in Missouri, but about a third in Iowa. It's got a rolling, undulating topography. It's predominantly in hay and pasture at this point, but also extensive croplands, and it has substantial issues in terms of impaired waters and also in terms of wildlife. And both the Missouri Department of Conservation and Iowa DNR have cited watersheds here in terms of their impairments. And so it's like, okay, so how do we do that? How do we fix that and keep farms profitable? In Ellen's work, she looked at a baseline scenario, which is the existing grassland right now, and compared that to two different land use scenarios. One was a buffer scenario where we would look at putting 100 feet of native, establishing 100 feet of native vegetation next to headwater stream or next to all streams. Up here, we in the middle graphic, you can see some of the small headwater streams that we would be buffering in that case. And then in a second one, a productivity scenario, we use the National Commodity Cropland Productivity Index created by USDA, and looked at areas that were below a 0.5 on that index, and looked at converting that cropland to native grasses. Why do we choose that? Because there's data that shows from an insurance perspective that many of those areas with a NCPPI level below 0.05, are a high risk in terms of ensuring low productivity and high risk. And then in terms of our results, here you can see some of the results. We're really looking at a tweak in terms of land use here. So if for that buffered scenario, it would be converting 0.4% of the watershed, or about 19,000 acres into the grassland. With that productivity scenario, it would be an order of magnitude more, so 4.5% increase, or a 225 acre conversion. And you can see here the numbers, as you look down in the table, they correspond to the graphics here on the right. What you can see here is that as we would do that integration, we would see greater and greater benefits in terms of several environmental outcomes. So we can reduce the sediment loss from that watershed. We can reduce the nitrogen loss from those crop fields, the phosphorus loss. We can sequester more carbon. We can support more pollinators. And then we can grow biomass, right? That could potentially be used for renewable natural gas production. And, whether that is financially viable is dependent on how much biomass is produced, and then how much industry is willing to pay for that biomass. But certainly there are scenarios that we looked at where this could be a profitable option. And the model that we use to develop these, the ecosystem service measures, is a model called INVEST, based out of the Natural Capital Project. And in terms of where some of those environmental benefits would accrue, it's different based on which scenario you're looking at. So you can see with that buffered scenario, the environmental benefits accrue in the upper portions of the watershed, whereas in that productivity scenario, the environmental benefits would pursue in the lower part of the watershed. So where the biomass is grown, where the land use change happens, matters in terms of where those outcomes would be generated. The other things that we found is that, while on an overall basis, that productivity scenario generated more substantial environmental benefits, on a per acre basis, right? The buffer scenario created more benefits on a per acre basis. And that's really because you're just being really strategic in terms of putting that native vegetation right next to the streams, and being able to capture that phosphorus, nitrogen, and especially sediment in this case. Also, with John's expertise, we looked at the potential for generating ecosystem services from the environmental benefits, if there was a market for these services. And again, we found pretty similar across the two scenarios in terms of the amount, with the difference there being with sediment, more sediment capture on a per acre basis with the buffered scenario. We found that the productivity scenario, again, overall had more capacity to generate revenue overall, but the per acre was more efficient on the buffered. We found that the cost of production for the bioenergy grassland, if we're again to harvest that grassy material, ranged between $238 and $288 per acre annually. And some of you may be looking at that cost and saying, well, that's pretty high. And that's because we factored in the opportunity costs associated with converting that land from corn and soybean production. We also found that the net revenue depends very heavily, again, on biomass yield. So how much can you grow and harvest on these lands, as well as the selling price. All right, then taking Ellen's work and connecting it with Illumide, who has expertise in techno-economic analysis and life cycle analysis, we then looked at, okay, so, how much could, say, a biofuel producer afford to pay farmers for that biomass? And here we looked at the feasibility of that renewable natural gas production, and we looked at two distance radiuses for the generation of that material. We looked at a 25-mile radius and a 50-mile radius, and in the lower, on the left-hand side here, you can see the placement or assumed placement of the anaerobic digesters. And on the lower right, you can see the scope of that we considered, where we drew our boundary on our system in terms of conducting that techno-economic and life cycle analysis. What we found is that there is an opportunity to generate positive net present values, but in order to generate those net present values, the biofuel producer has to be given credit for 4 different environmental outcomes. So the first of them is the ability to sell the digestate, so the material left over from the digester after you take off the gas, is as fertilizer. So both the solid and the liquid, if that can be sold as fertilizer, plus if you can generate renewable identification numbers through the EPA D3 program for the production of a biofuel. Plus, if the gas could generate credits through California or maybe some other state level clean fuels program. The LCFS is the California's low carbon fuel standard. But other potential state level clean fuels programs as well. Right now, generating gas from grassy biomass is not credited under California's program or any other clean fuels program that I'm aware of. But if that could be credited, adding those 4 things up, the fertilizer replacement, so not generating or replacing fossil-based fertilizers, the EPA RIN credits, as well as the low carbon fuel standard or some other clean fuels program, it could generate net positive values. The range that we looked at, we saw a variation from a $9 million for the low yield scenario, which would be at 3 tons per acre per year within a 25-mile radius of an anaerobic digester. And that 3 tons we think is very reasonable given biomass data that we've collected on the STRIPS program, to as much as $6 billion for a very high yield scenario. So for example, if there were the restored grassland, if you could harvest 6 tons per acre and then profitably gather that material within a 50-mile radius. So that's kind of where we're looking at in terms of what it would take to make this actually profitable. And then, how does this compare then to fossil natural gas that we would be looking at replacing? It compares fairly well. The greenhouse gas emissions are 15 grams per CO2 equivalent, or 15 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule of RNG, which compares to 61.1 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule for fossil natural gas. This is a 75% reduction in greenhouse gases. And so it meets the EPA's Environmental Protection Agency's goal for a 60% reduction in GHG emissions associated with a cellulosic biofuel. Shown a different way, some of the things that we're considering as we look at developing the grass to gas value chain. Here you can see where some of these different numbers come from. And whereas the numbers I showed you before were very specific to that Grand River, the Grand River watershed scenario, this is a more generalized scenario for grass to gas that Illumide and Mark produced. And you can see the total emissions here being 18.4 grams per megajoule of greenhouse gases, and comparing this to the whole, life cycle processes associated with conventional natural gas production, and the expected total emissions being 61.1 grams. And you can see the sources of those different emissions. So positive in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So in sum here, what's next? As I mentioned, this is an integrated modeling study. We are in the process of sewing these 2 studies together. There's a few more things that we still need to do that could help inform whether this is both environmentally beneficial as well as financially feasible. We need to look at, looking at integrating in the potential environmental markets to the landowner or farmer in this case, with the environmental markets available to the biofuel producer. That's one of our next steps. We also need to look at potential reduction in emissions from changes in land use. So right now we haven't factored in, for example, reduced nitrous oxide emissions associated with that conversion of corn and soybean acres to the prairie biomass. And we need to factor that reduction of greenhouse gas emissions into the overall life cycle as well. And then also factoring in the insurance risk in a quantitative way. So those are some of the directions that we're headed. The other thing I would say is that this overall direction, we were fortunate to, as a team, be awarded one of the new USDA Climate Smart Commodities proposal, or Climate Smart Commodities grants for the Horizon 2 Climate Smart Partnership. And Raceline Alternative Energy is the lead on this. Iowa State is one of 14 partner institutions with this. And, with this modeling study, we used a lot of literature values to inform it. What the new Climate Smart Commodities project will allow us to do is to actually take, on the ground measurements and verify, some of the directions in an actual location, right? That the direction that the modeling study suggests. So with that, I would just like to close by saying thank you. Thank you to the overall Sea Change team up in the upper right there that's contributed to the thinking around this. And thank you to the team at Raceland, especially for their leadership in this area. And you can see pictures of Ellen Audia, the student that did the land use change study, and then Olumide Askin, the engineer that did the techno-economic and life cycle study here. Thanks for your attention. And Matt, I think we're ready for Q&A.
Right. Are there a couple slides about any?
Yeah, we do have a couple slides.
Okay, I'll do that while you catch your breath and drink of water if you need to. So if you are on here today and need or would like a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And then I think do we have one on the next webinar as well?
Yep.
We have one more this year? We have one more this year. Okay, we have Herrick Sutton from University of Michigan talking about embracing real-world variability to improve cover crop outcomes. So one last cover crop webinar in 2022. Okay, we have got some questions here. There are a couple people that really like the few slides, so maybe they could get in touch with you directly, Lisa, if there's something they would like in particular, if that's
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, I'm happy to share the slides. Ellen's study was published this fall in Renewable Food and Agricultural Systems, I think is the name of the journal. I'm happy to share that as well. And hopefully next year we'll see Olumide's work published as well. Okay, great.
Actually maybe, while Lisa's answering, I'll find Lisa's contact information and put that in the chat box. Okay, so the first question is, as a livestock producer in north central Iowa, manure is highly valuable for their cropping system. Apart from the obvious capital cost as well as operational cost, what happens to the value of the raw manure when it is digested versus direct application as we do now?
Great, that's a fantastic question. And Dan Anderson, you should have him on here to be able to answer that in really depth detail, because he's thought a lot about that. I can tell you what I've learned from Dan and also Tom Richard, others that study the actual anaerobic digestion process. And when anaerobic digestion happens, right, what is being converted is mostly the carbon, right, and then some of the hydrogen in there. So, and then oxygen. So the two main products of biodigestion are going to be methane, CH4, and then carbon dioxide, CO2. And so then the rest of the nutrient value, if you're looking at the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, sulfur, calcium, like all that is moving through. And so basically what we're doing is gathering more value from the carbon, the oxygen, and the hydrogen, while the other nutrients, they can move through. One thing that happens in that anaerobic digestion process as well is because it's the microbes within the digester heat up, they kill many of the microbes that have negative health consequences. And so another big advantage of anaerobic digestion is just reducing, some of the bad bugs that we put out into our environment associated with manure, while keeping so many of the good things, that nutrient value with the manure. Recognize, there was also a question about the cost intensive character of anaerobic digestion. Yes, it's not a cheap process. For the industries that are investing in anaerobic digestion across the country in the Midwest right now, and there's many of them, working with Raceland on Raceland Alternative Energy on the grass to gas project. But just outside of Ames, there's also Verbio, which is also looking at grass to gas, right? Primarily looking at corn stover right now, but there's other industries as well. Vanguard Renewables, for example, GEVO, that are building digesters on manure. And the reason that is profitable right now is because of the clean fuel standards that are being developed. California, Oregon, the EPA program. It's much more profitable in the manure sector than it is in the grass to gas sector right now, because the reduction in emissions are so much greater. And that's the value that these clean fuels programs, the state level clean fuels programs, are paying for, is the reduction in that greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's why it's profitable under certain infrastructural constraints within the animal agricultural industry right now.
Okay, great. Next question is, where is it? A number of years before commercial implementation.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And well, there's a commercial pilot already being constructed, and that commercial pilot is on the Sievers family farm in eastern Iowa. So Brian Sievers, Lisa Sievers, and their partners have had an anaerobic digester on their property for some time to address nutrient return, as well as reducing, emissions associated with their cattle operation there. In joint partnership with Raceland Alternative Energy now, they're expanding to add in the grass to gas value chain as well. And so that commercial pilot is under construction right now, and expects to be actually producing renewable natural gas early next year. However, there's also the commercial operation of Verbio, right, just in Nevada, Iowa, east of Ames here, that is already producing, commercially producing renewable natural gas, again from corn stover in this case. And of course, there's many commercial operations in Europe, in Germany, in Denmark, and Italy, and it's because of the favorable governmental policies in those locations that sort of the grass to gas scenario is profitable in those locations. But we should have a couple here in Iowa within months to the next year.
Do you know, next couple more questions here, do you know with Verbio if they're thinking about anything other than corn stover?
Indication, yeah, they've indicated that they are interested in other feedstocks as well, from what I know, and it would be interesting, to have them come on and talk about what they're doing. But switchgrass is probably the next candidate feedstocks. stock for them, just in terms of trying to, reduce the heterogeneity in the quality and the composition of that feedstock, right? And as they feed it into the digester, and just being able to manage, for a more consistent flow of gas in that situation. But in talking with folks at VerBio, they are very interested in expanding. Of course, why focus on corn stover to begin with? Because there's a lot of it.
Got a lot of it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Couple more. I guess for some folks that maybe have been around a bit. Maybe 20 years ago or so, there was some investment in anaerobic digestion in the state. What might be different this go around, and how do we make sure that something might scale for small and medium sized operators?
Yeah, great question. And again, so Dan Anderson would be fantastic, to have on here as somebody that's really an expert in that anaerobic digestion piece. My understanding from talking with Dan and others that have been working on digesters is that, we're not talking about your, 20 to 30-year-old digester and operations here, right? That there's been a lot of innovation in anaerobic digestion since some of those older digesters went in, and certainly from the standpoint of digester design, there's innovation there. There's innovation in terms of the operation, trying to automate more of the digester operation, so you don't have to babysit it so much, quite so closely. And certainly, renewable natural gas as opposed to electricity, there's innovation there. That said, what was it? Just 2 weeks ago, EPA issued a ruling about the production, or a draft ruling. It's just draft at this stage. There's, I think, a 90-day comment period. We're opening up that the RIN, the Renewable Identification Number program, to also include the development of e-RINs, right, where biogas could be upgraded to electricity, and if that electricity is used for transportation, then the producer of that electricity could get credits through the EPA's program that way. Because the generating electricity from biogas is a lower cost option than renewable natural gas, that opens up a lot more profitable options for smaller farms. So, that's exciting, right? To expand that option and allow it to be profitable at smaller farms. The other thing is, I would say that as there's investment in this space, that one of the areas that people are seeking to innovate in is on that scale question. So instead of thinking about, energy systems being very large and concentrated, can we develop energy systems that are much smaller and distributed? And there are all sorts of advantages to society in smaller distributed energy systems. Think solar arrays, right? Also moving towards smaller scale distributed energy systems. And I think given the amount of investment and innovation in this space, there's that opportunity to be able to scale these digesters down and keep them profitable on smaller farms. Do we have a long way to go to get there? Yes. But that's why I'm thankful for investment from the U.S. federal government and things like the Climate Smart program, the new Infrastructure Act, right, and as well as private industry investing in this space to be able to actually achieve that vision.
Great, thanks, Lisa. That captures our questions. And yeah, as we think about all the things we had 20 years ago, we didn't have the smartphones that do everything. So sensors and technology to, remotely monitor things are a lot different than they were back then. So maybe if you can go back one slide for Just for those that need a CCA CEU reminder, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at istate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. So with that, I want to thank Lisa for excellent presentation in this work. Hopefully folks saw in the chat box, I provided her contact information linked to her ISU profile page. And with that, any parting comments, Lisa?
Just want to again thank you for hosting. Thank Iowa Learning Farms, and certainly thank all of our cooperators on the Sea Change Grass to Gas project, especially the students that did the hard work here. Right, I get to be in front of you to present today, but really the credit for all the cool graphics and data goes to Ellen Audia and Olumide Olefaskin. So thanks to those two.
All right, thanks a lot.